Hi, I'm Ilia, and I'm going to talk today a little bit about female sexuality in Victorian literature, and the Victorian novel specifically. So, the Victorian era spanned the 63-year reign of Queen Victoria, from between 1837 and 1901. During this period, Britain acquired the largest empire the world had ever seen, and prospered under the Industrial Revolution. At the same time, however, death rates were high, working conditions were inhumane, and cities became hotbeds for cholera, typhus, and smallpox due to lack of sanitation and overpopulation. So why should we care about sexuality in Victorian literature? First of all, the Victorian era both shaped and defined modern ideas about sexuality and gender. In understanding how Victorian literature depicts women, we can better comprehend how our own culture perpetuates rigid ideas about female sexuality. Secondly, in the Victorian era, literature became a tool of control, in the same way that the media today can be used to maintain certain social orders. Narratives exist in the articles of our newspapers, in the posts that we see on Twitter and on Instagram, and also in the stories that were sold through advertising. By seeing literature as a tool, we can more easily understand how narratives are constructed to uphold social orders. And thirdly, while the 1800s might seem like a long time ago, the questions we ask about Victorian society and literature resemble many of the questions that we ask our own society today. Is there a correct way of being a man or a woman? How far can we push the limits of sexuality and gender? And are there limits at all? What consequences are there for those who try and break from the mold? I tried to answer some of these questions by looking at two Victorian novels, North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell and She by H. Rider Haggard. She was an adventure novel published in 1887. It follows the adventures of Horace Holly and his nephew Leo as they travel to Eastern Africa and come across a mysterious society called the Amahaga, controlled by the ruthless female dictator Aisha. Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South was published some 20 years earlier and is a social novel that follows Margaret Hale, who moves from the quaint southern village of Helstone to the industrial northern town of Milton. And here Margaret meets the mill owner John Thornton, who is in the midst of a dispute with his striking employees over low pay and bad working conditions. So to understand how sexuality and gender function in these novels, it's important I outline some of the literary theories that backdrop the Victorian era. Michel Foucault, a prolific 20th century philosopher, argued against the common conception that Victorian society was prudish and straight-laced. Instead, bourgeois society of the 19th century attempted to control sex to such an extent that it became one of the most contentious facets of Victorian life. While pornography and prostitution boomed, other industries, psychiatry, medicine, and the criminal justice system, for example, incessantly attempted to regulate sex and sexuality, which had become the 19th century's open secret. Foucault says that one had to speak of sex as a thing not simply condemned or tolerated, but managed, inserted into systems of utility, and regulated for the greater good of all. Literature became a medium through which Victorians could enforce these social orders, and with the categorization of sex and sexuality came the idea that men and women operate in two separate spheres. These separate spheres hinge on the idea that men are naturally suited to the public sphere of politics, professionalism, and wage labour. Meanwhile, women belong to the private sphere and should preoccupy themselves with domesticity, housekeeping, and emotional labour. The novels North and South and She both feature female protagonists who traverse these separate spheres and flout the rules that regulate female sexuality in the 19th century. However, these women face wildly different consequences. North and South Margaret is tamed, restrained, and disciplined into Victorian social categories, while She's Aisha is destroyed, eradicated, and annihilated. Haggard's Aisha and Gaskell's Margaret both use their femininities to defy these separate spheres. In She, Aisha entirely disregards these rigid spheres and rules over a society which endorses female supremacy and male subservience. One of Aisha's followers outlines this society's hierarchy, stating that in this country, women do as they please. We worship them and give them their way, because without them, the world could not go on. They are the source of life. Haggard justifies Aisha's unquestioned governance by contextualizing it within a society that permits a woman to reign freely and tyrannically. Believing that she has found her long-lost love in Horace Holly's nephew, Aisha unveils her plans to flee Africa in order to rule Britain with Leo, as she has ruled the Yamahaga. Using destructive language, Aisha exclaims that she will attempt to destroy the tyrants in British government, overthrow the current queen, and claim for herself a hierarchical position above the law. Here, Haggard taps into the Victorian anxiety of reverse colonisation. Reverse colonisation is the fear that the coloniser will find himself in the position of the colonised, the exploiter will become the exploited, and the victimiser will become victimised. This is a key premise of the invasion scare narrative, a plot structure that centres on the racist fear that Britain will be invaded by primitive forces. Horace Holly's concerns about Aisha's revolutionary desires echo the concerns of reverse colonisation through the invasion scare narrative. He states that, in the end, she would, I had little doubt, assume absolute rule over the British dominions, and probably over the whole earth. And, though I was sure that she would speedily make ours the most glorious and prosperous empire that the world has ever seen, it would be at the cost of a terrible sacrifice of life. It is this that deems Aisha untamable. Her painful death at the end of the novel is triggered by Holly's fear that Aisha's uncontrollable and destructive femininity will leave the bubble of Yamahaga society, and instead impart destruction upon Holly's society, Britain. For Holly, Aisha's sexuality is untamable because it relates in direct proportion to how useful, or in this case, how threatening, she is to Britain. Unlike Aisha, North and South's protagonist, Margaret Hale, is eventually tamed, namely because by the end of the narrative, she is married to the male protagonist, Mr. Thornton. The marriage plot was an overwhelmingly popular plot structure used by authors of this time, and seen frequently in the works of Jane Austen and the Bronte sisters. The conclusion of marriage was so predictable and inevitable that authors were at liberty to play with their characters' sexualities before eventually conforming to the norm of heterosexual marriage. For this reason, Gaskell experiments with Margaret's presence outside of the private feminine sphere and in the realm of the dangerous masculine public sphere. In some instances, Gaskell does this quite literally, using Mr. Thornton's drawing room as representative of the private sphere, where Margaret is safe and protected. Margaret leaves Thornton's drawing room to quell the protests of the striking employees. However, she is assaulted by the strikers, and whilst in this public sphere, she physically relies on Mr. Thornton's masculine presence to protect her, as she lies wounded on the ground and uses his help to retreat safely back into the private sphere of his home. While being unable to live autonomously in this public sphere, Margaret ends up being useful in her ability to bring these two spheres together. The language that Gaskell has Margaret use is particularly indicative of this. Literary critic Nancy Armstrong argues that through domestic fiction, writing for and about the female introduced a whole new vocabulary. This vocabulary was based on the emotional interiority of a person, and this more feminine way of writing led to a specialized language for women. Ultimately, it is this feminine language that proves Margaret to be useful. Through this language, she is able to reconcile both the private and public spheres, so as to create an entirely new space where her femininity does not threaten the Victorian social order of the separate spheres. In her ability to empathise with and understand the strikers through this feminine language, Margaret is also able to mend the social differences between Mr. Thornton and his employees. Gaskell therefore uses Margaret's femininity to bridge not only the separation between the private and public spheres, but also to mend Victorian Britain's fractured class system. Consequently, Margaret is capable of being tamed because she is not a threat to the Victorian social order, and instead she works to harmonise these tensions between the public and private spheres and the middle and the working classes. In other words, Margaret is tameable due to her ability to fit into a newly created social sphere, which promotes the mediation between classes on an analogy between marriage and class cooperation. So, to conclude, whether female sexuality in Victorian culture is capable of being tamed or not depends entirely on whether it is useful or not to Victorian British society. Margaret's sexuality is tameable because it restores differences in Victorian class structures, such as the middle classes and the working classes. Aisha's sexuality, however, threatens to destroy and deconstruct imperialist forces, hence she is untamable. And looking at these two novels together, the tameability of the main female character is inherently connected to her social usefulness. So what is the contemporary relevance of this research? Ultimately, it would be unwise to assume that Victorian notions of femininity are entirely absent from contemporary society. Traces of Victorian gender and sexual categories persist in contemporary narratives, where femininity is valued only insofar as it helps to further dominate and to further dominant national prerogatives, be it the racist suppression of a woman who doesn't appear to conform to the established imperial order, or be it the public chastisement of a television personality reprimanded for being untamable or unlikable by both the media and the public. Even today, in instances where female sexuality poses a social threat, it is often violently and sometimes even tragically disposed of. Thank you.